In 701 BC, 185,000 Assyrian soldiers surrounded Jerusalem, the most feared army the ancient world had ever seen, against a city with no army, no allies, and no way out. Their king, Sennacherib, had already burned through 46 other cities in the region. Every single one had fallen. By morning, 185,000 of those soldiers were dead, not from a battle, not from a siege, in one night. The Bible says a single angel did it. Now here's the part that made me want to investigate this. Sennacherib's own military records, sitting in the British Museum right now, describe every victory of that campaign in detail. He brags about trapping Jerusalem's king like a bird in a cage. What he never explains is why he packed up and went home. His own records accidentally confirm that something happened that night that he could not bring himself to write down. Let's investigate. To understand what happened that night, you first need to understand the world these people lived in. And I don't mean a Sunday school version of it. I mean the actual brutal geopolitical reality of the ancient Near East around 700 BC. The Assyrian Empire didn't just conquer cities, they skinned people alive. They impaled survivors on wooden stakes outside the city walls as a warning to the next town down the road. They stacked severed heads into pyramids at the city gates and left them there to rot in the sun so that anyone who passed by would think twice about resisting. They deported entire populations, relocating hundreds of thousands of people across their empire to shatter cultural identity and prevent organized rebellion. And this isn't exaggeration or propaganda from their enemies. These are details the Assyrians themselves bragged about in their own royal inscriptions. They carved these scenes into palace walls in meticulous detail, panel after panel, so every visiting diplomat and vassal king would see exactly what happened to anyone who resisted. Their military machine was something the ancient world had never encountered before. Iron weapons when most armies still used bronze. Cavalry units that could cover ground faster than any messenger could carry a warning. Siege engineers who could build a ramp of packed earth and stone up to the top of a city wall in weeks. And a logistics system that kept hundreds of thousands of soldiers supplied across thousands of miles of desert and mountain. And when a city fell, the Assyrians made absolutely certain that no one who heard about it would ever consider resistance. In the palace of Sennacherib's father, Sargon II, in the ancient city of Corroborating, archaeologists found wall relief panels showing captives being led away with hooks through their lips. In Sennacherib's own palace in Nineveh, the walls were covered with detailed carvings of the siege of Lachish, a city in Judah. Defenders impaled on stakes. Families marched into exile. The city in flames. Sennacherib was so proud of the Lachish campaign that he dedicated an entire room in his palace to it. An entire room. Of all the victories in his career, this is the one he wanted visitors to see first. And Lachish was just one city. There were 46 others. The book of 2 Kings, chapter 18, records that in the 14th year of King Hezekiah, Sennacherib came up against all the fortified cities of Judah and captured them, all of them. The Hebrew word used here is tafas, and it doesn't just mean captured. It carries the weight of total seizure, complete possession. These weren't partial victories. Every fortified position outside Jerusalem had been taken. And Lachish, the second most important city in the kingdom? The siege ramps are still there today. Archaeologists have excavated them. You can see the arrowheads embedded in the ancient walls, exactly where they struck during the assault. You can see the iron chains the defenders dropped from the walls trying to hook and stop the battering ram. They failed. The city burned, the population was killed or marched into exile in chains. Now here's where the story gets personal. Hezekiah was not some weak king who'd been coasting on inherited power. He was actually one of the most impressive rulers in the entire biblical record. The text says he trusted in the Lord, the God of Israel, so that there was none like him among all the kings of Judah after him, nor among those who were before him. That's a staggering statement. None like him before or after. He'd spent years purifying the national worship, tearing down the high places and the Asherah poles, removing the bronze serpent that Moses had made hundreds of years earlier because people had started treating it like an idol and burning incense to it. He smashed it, a relic of the Exodus, one of the most sacred objects in Israelite history, and Hezekiah destroyed it because the people had turned it into something it was never meant to be. That takes conviction. That takes the kind of leader who cares more about getting things right than about popular opinion. He'd also fortified Jerusalem. 2 Chronicles 32 describes how Hezekiah strengthened the walls, built towers, constructed a second outer wall, and produced weapons and shields in large quantities. He even engineered one of the most impressive infrastructure projects of the ancient world, Hezekiah's Tunnel, a water channel carved through 1,750 feet of solid rock under the city of Jerusalem to redirect the waters of the Gihon Spring inside the city walls. This tunnel still exists. You can walk through it today. The chisel marks are still on the walls. They even found the inscription the workers carved when the two teams digging from opposite ends met in the middle. This was a king who planned, who prepared, who took action, and none of it was enough. All 46 of his other cities were burning, his allies had been crushed, and the most powerful army on earth was camped outside his last remaining walls. The tunnel was keeping the water flowing. The walls were holding, but everyone inside those walls knew the math. Sennacherib had taken every other fortified city in the kingdom. Jerusalem's defenses were better, but not better enough. Not against an army that had never lost. This is the part most videos skip over. They jump straight to the miracle. But if you don't feel the weight of what Hezekiah was facing, the miracle means nothing. Imagine you've spent your entire life doing the right thing. You've made every sacrifice, followed every instruction, committed everything to a cause you believe in. And now, despite all of that, you're watching everything you've built get systematically dismantled. The people you trusted have abandoned you. The plans you made have failed. And the thing that's coming for you is bigger, stronger, and more ruthless than anything you could ever fight on your own. That's Hezekiah's Tuesday morning in 701 BC. And then Sennacherib does something even more cruel than laying siege. He sends a messenger, the Rabshakeh. That's not a name, by the way. It's a title. It means something like chief cupbearer or chief officer, a senior Assyrian military official. And Sennacherib sends him to stand outside the walls of Jerusalem and deliver a speech. And this speech is one of the most psychologically devastating pieces of propaganda in the entire ancient world. The Bible actually records it in detail, and when you look at the Hebrew, you realize this wasn't just trash talk. This was a precision psychological weapon designed to do one specific thing: break the will of the people inside those walls without firing a single arrow. The Rabshakeh stands within earshot of the defenders on the wall and starts talking. And he doesn't speak Aramaic, the diplomatic language that only educated officials would understand. He speaks Hebrew, the language of the common people. He wants every single person standing on those walls to hear and understand every word. 2 Kings chapter 18, verse 19. The Rabshakeh says, "Say to Hezekiah, thus says the great king, the king of Assyria, what is this confidence in which you trust?" And then he systematically dismantles every reason Jerusalem has for hope. You're counting on Egypt? Egypt is a broken reed. If you lean on it, it'll pierce your hand. That's almost word for word from the text. And archaeologically, he was right. Egypt had already lost at El-Tekeh. You're counting on your God. Isn't Hezekiah the one who removed the high places and altars? How do you know your God isn't angry with you for that? This is brilliant psychological warfare, by the way. He's using Hezekiah's own religious reforms against him. He's planting the seed of doubt in the minds of the people. Maybe our king offended God by tearing down those altars. Maybe that's why the Assyrians are winning. Maybe Hezekiah got it wrong. And the terrible genius of this argument is that it takes something true. Hezekiah did remove the altars and twists it into something terrifying. The best lies always start with real facts. And if you've ever been in a situation where someone takes something good you did and reframes it as the reason everything is going wrong, if someone has ever said, well, If you hadn't done X, maybe Y wouldn't have happened, when X was the right decision and Y has nothing to do with it. That's the Rabshakeh's technique. It's ancient, and it still works on people every single day. Then the Rabshakeh goes even further. He says in verse 25, "Have I now come up without the Lord's approval against this place to destroy it? The Lord said to me, go up against this land and destroy it." Read that again. The Assyrian commander is claiming that Israel's own God sent him, that this siege is God's will, that resistance is futile because you'd be fighting against your own deity. The officials on the wall panic. They tell the Rabshakeh to please speak in Aramaic, not Hebrew, because the common people on the wall can hear everything. And the Rabshakeh's response is chilling. He basically says, "I'm not talking to you, I'm talking to them." Then he raises his voice even louder and starts making promises directly to the people of Jerusalem. "Surrender, and I'll give you a good life. I'll take you to a land like your own land, with grain and wine and olive trees. Don't let Hezekiah deceive you. He cannot deliver you. No god of any nation has ever delivered their people from the king of Assyria. Why would yours be any different?" Now, the Hebrew word he uses when he says Hezekiah cannot deliver you is natsal. And that word is important because it doesn't just mean rescue in a generic sense. It means to snatch away from danger, to pluck out of someone's hand. It's the word used for pulling a lamb out of the mouth of a lion. The Rabshakeh is saying, you are already in the mouth of the lion, and nobody is coming to pull you out. And here's the thing that makes the silence of the people on the wall so devastating. 2 Kings 18 verse 36. The people were silent and answered him not a word, for the king's command was, "Do not answer him." They just stood there, hearing every word, believing probably that he was right, because everything he'd said about Egypt was true. Everything he'd said about the other nations was true. No one had stopped Assyria. Not one god, not one army, not one alliance. The Rabshakeh wasn't lying about Assyria's track record. He was just wrong about one thing, and he couldn't have known what that thing was. I want you to sit in that silence for a moment, because this is what hopelessness sounds like. Not screaming, not crying, not fighting, silence. The silence of people who have heard an argument so overwhelming, so backed by evidence, so logically airtight that they have absolutely nothing to say in return. The Rabshakeh presented his case and the defense rested, not because they chose to, but because they had nothing left. Have you ever been there? A conversation where the other person laid out facts, real facts, undeniable facts, and you just went quiet. Not because you were choosing the high road, but because you literally had no response? That's the Wall of Jerusalem in 701 BC. But watch what happens next, because the silence of the people is not the end of the story. It's the setup for the most important prayer in the Old Testament. Before we get to that prayer, though, we need to understand what Hezekiah does when the messengers bring him the Rabshakeh's words, because his response has layers that most people rush right past. 2 Kings 19, verse 1. When King Hezekiah heard it, he tore his clothes, covered himself with sackcloth, and went into the house of the Lord. In English, that sounds like a simple description. A man ripped his shirt and went to the temple. But the Hebrew here carries weight that English completely misses. The word for tore is kara, and in ancient Hebrew culture, kara wasn't just a gesture of sadness. It was the most extreme physical expression of grief and distress that existed. You tore your garments when someone died. You tore your garments when you received news so devastating that language couldn't contain it. It was the body saying what the mouth couldn't. And then he covered himself with sackcloth. The Hebrew is sack, and it refers to a rough, dark fabric made from goat or camel hair that was worn against the skin. It was uncomfortable by design. It was a physical act of mourning, of humiliation before God. It said, "I have nothing left. I am bringing nothing to this moment except my need." And then the third detail, he went into the house of the Lord. Not to his war room, not to his generals, not to his counselors. He went to the temple. Now let me pause here because I want you to catch something about the sequence. He didn't go to the temple first. and then tear his clothes for dramatic effect. He heard the report. His body responded with kara, the visceral, involuntary expression of a man at the absolute end of his rope. And then, in that broken state, he went to God. He didn't clean himself up first. He didn't compose himself. He went broken. This is a pattern that shows up again and again in Scripture, and it's the opposite of what faith looks like in our imagination. We picture confidence, certainty, standing tall and believing hard enough. But Hezekiah shows us something different. Faith here looks like a king in torn clothes, wearing the ancient equivalent of a hair shirt, stumbling into the temple not because he's sure it'll work, but because he has literally nowhere else to go. And if you're watching this and you've ever been in a place where you've tried everything, called everyone, exhausted every option, and you're standing there with nothing left, that's exactly where Hezekiah is. That's the position the story says faith actually begins in. Then Hezekiah does something remarkable. He sends messengers to the prophet Isaiah, and Isaiah sends back a message in 2 Kings 19 verse 6. Do not be afraid because of the words that you have heard, with which the servants of the king of Assyria have blasphemed me. Pay attention to that phrasing. God doesn't say, don't be afraid of the army. He says, don't be afraid of the words. The Hebrew for words here is devarim, and it's the same word used for the 10 commandments, the 10 words of God. The Rabshakeh's speech was, in its own dark way, a counter-proclamation, a set of counter-commandments. Your God is powerless. Surrender. Obey me. And God's response through Isaiah is essentially, those words are nothing. They are blasphemy against me, and I will deal with them. But then Sennacherib sends a letter, because the psychological warfare isn't over. 2 Kings 19 verse 10. The letter repeats the same message. Don't let your God deceive you. No God has saved any nation from Assyria. You will not be different. And here's where Hezekiah does the thing that I believe is the most important action in this entire story, more important than the miracle that follows. Verse 14. Hezekiah received the letter from the hand of the messengers and read it. Then Hezekiah went up to the house of the Lord and spread it before the Lord. He took the letter, he walked into the temple, and he physically unrolled it on the ground in front of the altar. The Hebrew word for spread here is paras. It means to stretch out, to lay flat, to open wide. He didn't summarize the letter for God. He didn't paraphrase it. He didn't say, God, you know what this letter says. He physically opened it and laid it out as if to say, read this, see what they're saying about you, see what I'm facing. There is something so raw and honest about this gesture that it almost doesn't feel like a religious act. It feels like a man walking into a room, slamming a threatening letter on the table and saying, okay, what are we going to do about this? And then Hezekiah prays. And this prayer, in verses 15 through 19, is one of the most structurally brilliant prayers in the entire Bible, because Hezekiah doesn't start by asking for help. He starts by establishing who God is. O Lord, the God of Israel, enthroned above the cherubim, you are the God, you alone, of all the kingdoms of the earth. You have made heaven and earth. The Hebrew word for alone here is levadeka, and the grammatical emphasis in this sentence is unmistakable. You, only you, alone. Not one of many gods, not the strongest God, the only God. In a world where every nation had its patron deity, where the Rabshakeh had just listed all the gods who failed to stop Assyria, Hezekiah begins his prayer by redefining the entire playing field. He's saying, those weren't gods, you are God. There is no category that contains both you and them. Then, after establishing God's identity, Hezekiah says something you'd never expect. It is true, Lord, that the Assyrian kings have laid waste these nations and their lands. They have thrown their gods into the fire, for they were not gods, but the work of human hands, wood and stone. He agrees with the enemy. The Rabshakeh was right. Those other gods didn't save anyone. Because they weren't real, they were wood and stone. Hezekiah doesn't deny the evidence. He reinterprets it. The Assyrians didn't defeat other gods, they destroyed statues. That's not the same thing. And then, finally, the ask. Now, O Lord our God, save us from his hand, so that all the kingdoms of the earth may know that you alone, O Lord, are God. The word save here is the Hebrew Hoshea, which is the root of the name Hosea and is closely connected to the name Yeshua, which becomes Jesus in Greek. It means to rescue, to deliver, to bring into a spacious place. And notice Hezekiah's motivation. He doesn't say, save us so we can live. He says, save us so that everyone will know who you are. His prayer isn't self-centered, it's God-centered, even at the edge of annihilation. Now think about your own life for a second. When was the last time you were so overwhelmed that you couldn't even put your situation into words? When was the last time you felt like you were under siege, like every direction was blocked, like the math didn't work no matter how you ran the numbers? Hezekiah shows us what to do in that moment. You don't need a perfect prayer. You don't need impressive faith. You take the letter, the bill, the diagnosis, the rejection, the impossible situation, and you spread it out before God. You lay it open. You say, I don't know what to do with this, but you see it. That's what Hezekiah did on the worst day of his life. And what happened next has been debated by scholars, archaeologists, and theologians for nearly 3,000 years. And real quick, if you're the kind of person who watches videos like this all the way through, you're already part of this community whether you've hit subscribe or not. So make it official. We go deep into the original languages every single week, and the next video after this one is going to take you somewhere even the scholars argue about. Subscribe so you don't miss it. So, Hezekiah has prayed the most structurally brilliant prayer in the Old Testament. He's spread the threatening letter before God. He's declared, you are God alone. And what God does next makes everything we've covered so far look like the warm-up act. Isaiah delivers God's response. And it is not gentle. 2 Kings 19, beginning at verse 20. The message to Sennacherib through Isaiah is almost poetic in its ferocity. God says the virgin daughter of Zion despises you. She laughs at you. She shakes her head behind you as you flee. The Hebrew imagery here is deliberately emasculating. In a culture where military conquest was the ultimate expression of masculine power, God describes Jerusalem as a young woman laughing at a retreating army. The contrast is intentional and devastating. You came here thinking you were the predator. You are the joke. Then God says something in verse 28 that targets the very core of Assyrian identity. Because you have raged against me and your arrogance has come up to my ears, I will put my hook in your nose and my bit in your mouth, and I will turn you back on the way by which you came. A hook in the nose, a bit in the mouth. These are the exact tortures the Assyrians inflicted on their captives. Their own wall reliefs show prisoners being led by hooks through their noses and lips. God is saying, I'm going to do to you exactly what you did to everyone else. The Hebrew word for hook is chach, and it's the same word used in ancient Near Eastern texts for the literal metal hooks Assyrian soldiers forced through the flesh of conquered people. God is speaking Sennacherib's own language of violence back to him. And then comes the prophecy about what will happen next. Verse 29 gives a sign. This year you will eat what grows of itself, and the second year what springs from the same, but in the third year sow and reap. This was a promise of restoration. The Assyrian invasion had devastated the agricultural cycle. Crops had been destroyed, fields burned. God is saying, it will take time, but the land will come back. You will plant again. You will harvest again. Then verse 32, he shall not come into this city or shoot an arrow there or come before it with a shield or cast up a siege mound against it. By the way that he came, by the same he shall return, and he shall not come into this city. No arrows, no shields, no siege ramp. He won't even set foot inside. He came from the north, and he'll go back north. The siege of Jerusalem will not happen. And the reason? Verse 34, for I will defend this city to save it, for my own sake, and for the sake of my servant David. For my own sake. The Hebrew is lema'ani, which means for the purpose of my own name, my own reputation, my own glory. God's intervention isn't just about Hezekiah's prayer or Jerusalem's survival. It's about what it would mean for the entire ancient world if the God of Israel's city fell to Assyria. Every nation was watching. Every other conquered people with their defeated gods was watching. And God says, essentially, this is about my name. Now, verse 35, this is the verse that has fueled 27 centuries of debate. And it came to pass that night that the angel of the Lord went out and struck down in the camp of the Assyrians 185,000. And when people arose early in the morning, behold, these were all dead bodies. One verse, 34 Hebrew words, 185,000 dead. Let's slow this down because almost every word in this verse matters and most translations flatten it. The angel of the Lord. The Hebrew is malach yiwah, and the word malach is one of the most misunderstood words in the entire Bible. When most people hear angel, they picture wings. They picture a gentle figure in white robes, maybe a halo. That image comes from medieval European art, not from the Hebrew Bible. The word malach simply means messenger, or one who is sent. It can refer to a human messenger, a prophet, or a divine agent sent by God for a specific purpose. But when the text says malach yehuh, the messenger of the Lord, with the personal divine name attached, it's signaling something specific. This isn't just any messenger. Throughout the Hebrew Bible, the angel of the Lord appears at critical moments, to Hagar in the wilderness, to Abraham on Mount Moriah, to Moses in the burning bush. And in many of these appearances, the angel speaks as God, acts as God, and is sometimes identified as God himself. Scholars have debated for centuries whether the malach yehuh is a separate being or a manifestation of God's own presence. What's clear is that this was not a chubby baby with tiny wings. This was a being with the authority and power to execute divine judgment on a scale that would reshape the geopolitical map of the ancient world in a single night. The next word, struck. The Hebrew is vayakeh, from the root nakah. This is a violent word. It's the same word used when Moses struck the rock, the same word used when David struck Goliath. It means to hit, to smite, to strike with lethal force. There is nothing gentle or metaphorical about this word. In the camp of the Assyrians. Not on a battlefield, in their camp, while they slept, while they thought they were safe outside the walls of a city they were about to conquer. The camp of 185,000 soldiers would have stretched across the hills around Jerusalem like a small city of tents. Fires burning, sentries posted, weapons stacked, siege equipment being assembled for the morning. And then, between nightfall and dawn, 185,000 of them stopped breathing. The text doesn't describe how. It doesn't say there was fire from heaven or a plague or a supernatural storm. It simply says the angel went out, struck them, and when morning came, they were dead. The Hebrew phrasing, vayashkimu baboker, and they arose early in the morning, creates a haunting image. The survivors, whoever was left, woke up at dawn expecting to begin the siege. And instead, they found themselves surrounded by the bodies of their own army. Let me put 185,000 into perspective for you. The entire population of Jerusalem at this time was probably somewhere between 20,000 and 30,000 people. The Assyrian army that died in one night was 6 to 9 times the population of the city they were besieging. In modern terms, if a city of 100,000 was surrounded by a military force of 900,000, and every single one of those soldiers died overnight, that would be a roughly equivalent ratio. No battle in the ancient world comes close to this casualty figure in a single engagement, let alone a single night with no battle at all. So what actually happened? This is where the investigation gets fascinating because we don't just have the biblical account, we have multiple external sources, and they all tell parts of the story without any of them telling the whole thing. Let's start with the Assyrian records, because empires keep receipts. The Taylor prism is a 6-sided clay cylinder covered in cuneiform writing. It was discovered in 1830 in the ruins of Nineveh. Sennacherib's capital, and it now sits in the British Museum in London. It is Sennacherib's own account of his military campaigns, dictated to scribes and preserved in baked clay for eternity. And here's what Sennacherib says about the Jerusalem campaign. He describes conquering 46 fortified cities in Judah. He lists the tribute he extracted. He brags about trapping Hezekiah like a bird in a cage inside Jerusalem. And then, nothing. He never says he conquered Jerusalem. He never says he breached the walls. He never describes a siege, an assault, or a victory. For a king who documented every triumph in granular, often gruesome detail, this silence is deafening. Think about what we're looking at. Sennacherib describes everything leading up to Jerusalem. He describes the cities he took before Jerusalem. He describes trapping Hezekiah, and then his account just moves on, as if the most important target of his entire campaign simply didn't happen. No ancient Near Eastern king leaves out a victory. They exaggerate victories, they fabricate victories, they take partial victories and describe them as total conquests, but they never ever omit a genuine triumph. If Sennacherib had taken Jerusalem, it would be the centerpiece of the Taylor prism. It would be carved on his palace walls in room-sized detail, the way the siege of Lachish was. Instead, we get the phrase, like a bird in a cage, and then silence. The most natural explanation for that silence is that something happened at Jerusalem that Sennacherib could not bring himself to record. A victory gets carved in stone, a defeat gets buried in silence, and that's only the Assyrian side of the evidence. What comes next is the part that still doesn't make sense to historians, because it comes from a completely different civilization, telling a completely different version of the same night. Now let's look at another source. The Greek historian Herodotus, writing about 2 centuries after the event, records a tradition that scholars have long connected to Sennacherib's campaign. In his Histories, Book 2, Herodotus tells the story differently. He places the scene at Pelusium, on the Egyptian border, and attributes the deliverance not to the god of Israel, but to the Egyptian pharaoh Sethos, a priest of the god Hephaestus. According to Herodotus, the Assyrian army was camped and ready for battle when, during the night, field mice swarmed the camp and gnawed through the bowstrings, shield straps and quiver handles of the soldiers, leaving them defenseless and forcing them to flee. Now, Herodotus was writing from an Egyptian perspective, using Egyptian sources. He wasn't trying to tell the Israelite version of this event. So, the details are filtered through a different cultural lens, the location is shifted, and the credit goes to an Egyptian god instead of YHWH. That's how ancient historiography worked. Every culture told the story with themselves at the center. But the core event is the same. Sennacherib's army suffered a sudden, inexplicable catastrophe during a nighttime encampment, and the campaign collapsed. Mice. That's Herodotus's version, and most modern scholars hear that and think it sounds bizarre, maybe like the kind of legend that gets distorted through 2 centuries of retelling. But here's where it gets interesting. In the ancient world, mice and rats were symbols of plague. The connection between rodents and epidemic disease was understood at least intuitively long before modern germ theory. The god Apollo, who was associated with both plague and healing in Greek mythology, was sometimes depicted with mice. In the biblical account of 1 Samuel, when the Philistines were struck with tumors after capturing the Ark of the Covenant, the guilt offering they sent back included golden mice, directly linking rodents with the plague that had struck them. So the presence of mice in Herodotus's account may actually be an ancient way of describing a sudden epidemic that swept through the Assyrian camp. It's like if someone 2,000 years from now found a reference to the invisible enemy and didn't realize we were talking about a virus. Some scholars have proposed bubonic plague, since the disease is carried by fleas on rodents and can kill rapidly in its pneumonic form. Others have suggested a form of cholera or dysentery, common in military camps with poor sanitation, especially in the hot climate around Jerusalem. The Assyrian camp, with 185,000 soldiers packed into a temporary city with improvised sanitation, would have been a perfect breeding ground for waterborne pathogens. Still others have proposed hantavirus, anthrax from contaminated animal products, or even a tainted water supply. The speed of the deaths, a single night, makes some medical explanations difficult, but not impossible for certain acute pathogens in a densely packed military camp. Pneumonic plague, for instance, can kill within 24 hours, and in a camp where soldiers sleep in close quarters, person-to-person transmission could spread with terrifying speed. But here's what I find compelling. The Bible doesn't say plague, it doesn't say disease, it doesn't say mice. It says malach Yahbuach, and whether the mechanism was supernatural in a way that defies all natural explanation, or whether God used a natural agent, a pathogen, a contamination event, something that operates within the created order, the text attributes the action to the direct intervention of God's messenger. And honestly, this is where a lot of videos on this topic get stuck. They either want to fully naturalize the event, explain it away with bacteria and bad sanitation, or they want to fully supernaturalize it with a glowing angel swinging a flaming sword through the camp. And the text doesn't actually demand either extreme. The text says God sent his agent, the agent struck the camp, and 185,000 died. The mechanism is not the point. The source is. Let me give you a modern analogy. If a tornado destroys a house, a meteorologist can explain the wind patterns, the pressure systems, the humidity and temperature differentials that created the funnel cloud. Every physical mechanism can be documented and explained, but the person standing in the rubble might say, God spared my family, and both statements can be true simultaneously. The natural explanation doesn't eliminate the supernatural agency. They operate on different levels of the same reality. What we know for certain from the convergence of biblical, Assyrian, and Greek sources is this. Sennacherib's army arrived at Jerusalem fully intact and fully capable of destroying it. Something catastrophic happened in the camp overnight. The siege never took place. The Assyrian army withdrew, and Sennacherib went home. Pay attention to this next detail, because it might be the most damning piece of evidence in this entire investigation. And it's been hiding in plain sight in a museum for over 100 years. The Lachish reliefs. These are massive stone panels carved on the walls of Sennacherib's palace in Nineveh, showing in cinematic detail the siege and conquest of Lachish, Judah's second city. The panels show Assyrian soldiers marching up siege ramps, defenders falling from the walls, prisoners being tortured and exiled, and Sennacherib himself sitting on his throne watching the conquest. These reliefs were given the most prominent position in the palace. The room that displayed them was right off the main entrance. Every visiting dignitary, every ambassador, every vassal king who came to Nineveh would have walked past the Lachish reliefs. And there are no Jerusalem reliefs. If Sennacherib had conquered Jerusalem, the capital city of Judah, the seat of Hezekiah's power, the temple city of the God of Israel, those reliefs would have been 10 times larger and 10 times more prominent than the Lachish panels. Jerusalem was the prize. Lachish was a secondary target. The fact that Sennacherib chose to immortalize Lachish instead of Jerusalem on his palace walls tells you everything you need to know about what happened. He needed something to show for the campaign. He'd invested massive resources, mobilized the largest army in the region, and come home without the one city that mattered. So he put Lachish on the walls as the consolation trophy. It's like a boxer who trains for 12 months for a championship fight, somehow loses, and then puts a picture of the weigh-in ceremony on his wall instead of the fight. You display Lachish when you can't display Jerusalem. And Sennacherib himself? According to 2 Kings 19 verse 37, he returned to Nineveh, and while he was worshipping in the temple of his god Nisroch, his own sons Adramelech and Sharezer struck him down with swords. Then they escaped to the land of Ararat, and his son Esarhaddon succeeded him as king. The Assyrian records confirm this. The Babylonian Chronicle documents the assassination. An inscription from Esarhaddon himself describes his brother's treachery and how he seized the throne. The details align with the biblical account. The man who mocked the God of Israel, who sent letters saying no God could save their people from Assyria, died on the floor of his own God's temple at the hands of his own children. The irony is so thick you could choke on it. He told Hezekiah that no God could protect his people. Then his own God couldn't protect him from his own sons. He boasted about the power of Nisroch's temple. He died in it. He said Jerusalem's God was just another powerless statue. 20 years later, he discovered the difference between a statue and a god, and the lesson killed him and his empire. The Assyrian Empire, the most feared military power the world had ever seen, the force that had devoured nations for centuries, collapsed completely within 80 years of this event. By 612 BC, Nineveh itself had fallen to a coalition of Babylonians and Medes. The city was so thoroughly destroyed that within 2 generations, people forgot where it even was. The palace walls with their Lachish reliefs and their conspicuously absent Jerusalem panels were buried under dirt and forgotten. They wouldn't be found again for over 2,000 years, when a British archaeologist started digging in the 1840s. The empire that was supposed to last forever didn't even outlast the grandchildren of the men who camped outside Jerusalem. So where does all of this leave us? We've looked at the Hebrew text, we've examined the Assyrian records, we've considered Herodotus, we've walked through the archaeological evidence, and every single source points to the same conclusion. Something extraordinary happened outside Jerusalem in 701 BC that stopped the most powerful military force on earth in its tracks. But I don't want to leave you in the ancient world, because this story isn't just about Hezekiah or Sennacherib or an angel in a military camp 3,000 years ago. This story is a blueprint, and if you've been paying attention to the details, you've already seen the pattern. Here's what the pattern looks like. A person is doing the right thing, following the path they believe in, building something that matters, and then a force shows up that is bigger, stronger, and more ruthless than anything they can handle. Not a minor inconvenience, a siege, something that surrounds them on every side and cuts off every escape route. Then voices start talking, and the voices sound reasonable. They say things like, "Look at the evidence, look at the track record. This situation has never ended well for anyone. Why would your case be different? Your resources are insufficient. Your allies have failed. The math doesn't work." And here's the brutal part. Those voices are telling the truth. The Rabshakeh wasn't lying about the other nations. Egypt really had failed. The other gods really hadn't saved anyone. The facts were the facts. But facts are not the full picture. Facts operate on one level of reality, and there is another level that facts cannot measure. Hezekiah's response was not to deny the facts. He didn't say the Assyrian army wasn't real. He didn't pretend the situation wasn't desperate. He took the threatening letter, every documented fact in it, and laid it open before God. He said, "Everything they're saying is true. The other nations fell. Their gods failed. I cannot fight this. But you are not those gods. You are God alone, and this situation is not bigger than you." And somewhere between nightfall and sunrise, 185,000 soldiers stopped breathing. If you're going through something right now, and I don't know what it is, maybe it's financial, maybe you're staring at a number that doesn't work, no matter how many times you recalculate it. Maybe it's relational. Maybe the person you trusted most has become the Rabshakeh in your story, standing outside your walls, telling you why it's over. Maybe it's a diagnosis, words on a piece of paper that feel like a death sentence for your future. Maybe it's a situation at work where the politics are stacked against you and every ally has gone quiet. Maybe it's something you haven't told anyone about, something you carry alone because saying it out loud would make it too real. I want you to hear what this story is actually saying. It's not saying that if you pray hard enough, God will magically fix your problems overnight. Sometimes the siege lasts longer than one night. Sometimes the deliverance looks different than what you expected. Sometimes the answer to the prayer doesn't come in the form you asked for. But the story is saying this: the size of the army doesn't determine the outcome. The voice of the enemy doesn't determine the outcome. The track record of previous defeats doesn't determine the outcome. The logic, the evidence, the rational calculation that says this is impossible does not have the final word. There is a dimension of reality that Sennacherib, with all his soldiers and siege engines and psychological warfare, could not see, could not calculate, could not defend against. And in a single night, That invisible dimension became the most real thing in the entire ancient Near East. 185,000 dead, not a single arrow fired from Jerusalem's walls. Sennacherib went home, and the bird in the cage was still singing. Now, I want to go one level deeper on this, because there's a detail in the story that almost nobody talks about, and it might be the most important detail of all. Before the angel came, before the 185,000 died, before Sennacherib retreated, Hezekiah didn't know any of that was going to happen. When he tore his clothes and walked into the temple, he had no guarantee. When he spread that letter on the ground, he didn't know if God would answer. When he prayed, "You are God alone," he was making a statement of faith, not a statement of certainty about the outcome. And that's the part most people miss. We read this story backward. We know how it ends. We know the angel comes. We know Sennacherib goes home. So Hezekiah's prayer feels almost procedural, like a necessary step before the predetermined happy ending. But Hezekiah didn't know the ending. He prayed from the same place you pray from not knowing, from hoping, from desperation. Faith is not knowing the outcome and acting anyway. Faith is Hezekiah walking into the temple with a torn robe and a threatening letter when every piece of evidence says God isn't going to show up. Because 46 cities have already fallen. Because Egypt has already failed. Because the track record says this doesn't work. And faith says, I know the record, I've read the letter, I see the army, and I still believe you are God alone. That's the part of the story that isn't about 701 BC. That's the part that's about this Tuesday. Your Tuesday. The one where you're staring at something that looks exactly as impossible as 185,000 Assyrian soldiers outside your walls. What is your Assyrian letter right now? What is the thing that has been telling you it's over, that the math doesn't work, that no one has ever survived what you're facing? Take it, spread it out, and say, you are God alone. That's not a magic formula. It's a position. It's the position Hezekiah found when every other position had been taken from him, and it was the only position he needed. And I want to point out one more thing before we close. Hezekiah's prayer didn't just change his situation, it changed history. If Jerusalem had fallen in 701 BC, the Davidic line would have ended. The temple would have been destroyed a century earlier. The prophecies about the Messiah coming from the line of David, from the city of Jerusalem, could not have been fulfilled. Every single thing that happened after this night, the entire trajectory of biblical history, depended on what happened in that camp. The birth of Jesus in Bethlehem, a city just 5 miles from Jerusalem, was only possible because Jerusalem survived this night. One prayer, one angel, one night. And the entire future of human history pivoted on the hinge of a king who had nothing left but the willingness to spread a letter on the ground and say, you are God alone. If that doesn't change how you see your impossible situation, I don't know what will. Here's what I want to leave you with. The Taylor Prism is still in the British Museum. You can look it up online. You can see the cuneiform where Sennacherib describes trapping Hezekiah like a bird in a cage. You can see the conspicuous absence where a Jerusalem victory should have been recorded. The Lachish reliefs are still in the British Museum too. You can see the siege ramps, the impaled defenders, the exiled families, and you can notice, if you're paying attention, that these reliefs exist precisely because the Jerusalem reliefs don't. 3,000 years later, the evidence is still sitting in glass cases in London, quietly confirming that something happened outside Jerusalem that the most powerful empire on earth couldn't explain, couldn't spin, and couldn't overcome. The Taylor Prism sits there with its conspicuous silence. The Lachish reliefs hang on the wall as the consolation prize of a king who couldn't take the city that mattered. And somewhere in a museum storage room, there are Assyrian arrowheads pulled from the walls of Lachish, physical proof that Sennacherib's army was real, that their weapons worked, and that their siege capabilities were everything the ancient sources claimed. All of that was aimed at Jerusalem, and none of it mattered. And the Hebrew word malach, messenger, the one who is sent, still sits in the text of 2 Kings 19 verse 35, waiting for someone to read it and realize that the forces operating on their behalf may be far larger than the forces lined up against them. Sennacherib had 185,000 soldiers. Hezekiah had a prayer and a torn robe, and the morning light revealed which one carried more weight in the economy of the universe. The Rabshakeh asked, "Who among all the gods of the lands has delivered their country from my hand, that the Lord should deliver Jerusalem from my hand?" And the answer came not in words, but in 185,000 bodies lying still in the morning sun. Some questions are answered with arguments, some questions are answered with evidence, and some questions are answered by an angel who doesn't bother explaining himself. If this investigation opened your eyes to something in the biblical text you'd never noticed before, subscribe. Because we do this every week. We go back to the original Hebrew and Greek. We lay the archaeological evidence next to the scripture, and we find the things that most people miss. The video on screen right now goes even deeper into another moment where God intervened in a way that history cannot explain. Click it, and I'll see you there.